Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Catherine Horton, and tonight is a very special night. I'm launching a new series of one-to-one interviews called Special Investigators. And the very first very special investigator who is here with me on the show is Dr. Joseph FARRELL, who many of you know. He's an expert on the Nazis, and as many of you know, I've been talking about the Nazis and Nazi-style programs being run in Europe and the US today. And I was trying to explain to people how it came about that we have the Nazis on our doorstep in our communities all this time. And if you really want to understand this problem, we have to go to the field experts in the matter. So I would like to introduce Dr. Farrell, sorry. He was born in South Dakota, and he has a PhD from my alma mater, which is the University of Oxford. And his doctorate is in patristics, and he'll say more about that. But then after that, he pursued research in physics, alternative history, and science in general, and what he calls strange stuff. And as we've now figured out, strange stuff is exactly what drives the world pretty much everywhere. So unless we understand the strange stuff, we will not be able to make head or tail of this. Now, one of the things I really would like to show you straight away is I would like to take you to a very important website that I think you should open up in a tab and have a look at straight away. It is Dr. Farrell's website called GizaDeathStar.com. So GizaDeathStar.com. And it looks like this. And a very important link is up here to books. If you look at the bookstore, you will see the books that he has published, and the newest one is called Microcosm and Medium. And I was just saying to Dr. Farrell that I've spoken to many people about this, but also Catherine Austin Fitz, and she gave an absolutely raving review about this book, and she said it is just genius. So she said that she's about 100 pages in, and it's just getting better and better. So really recommend that one for sure, but also all the others. And I just want to scroll through because there are many books here that are relevant to the topic of the Nazis straight away. Here, for example, Reich of the Black Sun, the Nazi secret weapons, very important. The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, the Nazis' incredible secret technology and covert wars, Clash of Civilizations, the Philosopher's Stone. It's really just secret research, and it just goes on and on and on. And it shows you here, for example, Financial Vipers of Venice, Nazi International. Now, Nazi International is, I think, a term that we can apply today without fail everywhere. But I want to draw your attention to this material because it's only when you start reading and going into the depths of all this that has been kept from us, and the alternative histories that are actually the real histories, only then can you understand the present that we're in now. So this is as a brief introduction. I am extremely thrilled to have Dr. Farrell here with us. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Doctor. This is a real honor.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dr. Horton. I appreciate it.
So actually, could you start with, I have to be honest, I'm very embarrassed to admit it, but when I first heard about it, I didn't know what patristics is, and I had to look it up. Could you explain it, to our viewers what it is as a field?
Patristics is the study of the church fathers and how they formulated church doctrine. It sounds like an incredibly narrow field, but in actual fact, it's actually the opposite, because to do it, you have to have a lot of languages, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and, the secondary scholarly languages in the field, German, French. It also requires you to know a lot about classical and medieval philosophy, the development of law, history, and philosophy of science. So in other words, it's actually very broad. So it's kind of a perfect sort of, interdisciplinary study for the kind of stuff I'm doing in these books. So it trained me well, I think, for what I'm doing now.
Well, I have to admit, it sounds so much broader than
Mhm.
my course. I did the undergraduate course in physics, and I did a PhD in particle physics. And
Mhm.
today, but not just today, but in the past 2 years that I was being attacked with modern weaponry, I discovered that even the physics I was taught was just far too narrow and was missing out lots of stuff.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I think you know more about the physics that I'm missing than I do with my PhD in physics, you know?
Well, I don't know if I know more, but I do know that there's a lot of stuff that they don't teach anymore. Mm.
Absolutely. So, you know, one of the things I'm so excited to dive straight into the entire Nazi topic, because so my brief backstory is before I went to Oxford, I went to school in Germany. So I went through the entire German school system, and I arrived in Germany as a refugee from communist Romania, as I
Oh,
was
wow.
member of the Hungarian minority there. So my parents and I, we fled communist Romania before the wall of the you know, in East Berlin, before the Iron Curtain came down. And it was very traumatic, very dark period. And we arrived in Germany, and we very much had the feeling of, oh, we made it, we left all this crime behind us, now life can start. And then, you know, strange things happened when I was a child, but they just got stranger and stranger. And by the time I arrived in Oxford in the year 2000, it was just like, I mean, by now I would call it Nazi land. You know, Oxford is one of the most dangerous places to be in. And I just, when I first started researching this, I had this creeping sensation I'm dealing with Nazis and Nazi methodology. And by now, I very much think I'm dealing with a Nazi concentration camp that I'm in with modern Nazi weaponry. But I had no idea how the hell we got here, because going through the German brainwash system, I would call it now, you get told that the Nazis lost the war, and then they went underground, and a few of them scuttled away and maybe survived for a bit in America. And that's just that, you know, and it's all fine. Nothing to see here. Move along, citizen.
Move along.
Nothing could be further from the truth. So, you know, could you please kind of re-educate me what the real story actually is?
Well, the real story, you know, we could jump in at almost any point, but I think the most convenient place to jump in is after the Battle of Stalingrad, when it became very clear to the upper echelons of the Nazi hierarchy that Germany was probably going to lose the war unless it completed some of its advanced research projects, which is, I think, one of the hidden motives in the war. You know, everybody is puzzled. Why does Adolf Hitler, as his armies are freezing to death, declare war on the United States, you know, when he's at the gates of Moscow and losing? And the hidden story there, of course, is the atomic bomb. And he had very good reason to assume that probably Germany would get it before the United States, which incidentally, I think they did. But that's another story. But I think the place to jump in here is that as the Nazi leadership, and in particular Martin Bormann, who is kind of the ominous grise, you know, of the Third Reich, he's actually running the Third Reich and the domestic situation while Hitler's taking care of the war. So, you know, it's effectively Martin Bormann that's running the show. And he begins a process. Various strategic evacuation plans are formulated after the disaster at Stalingrad. And if you go to a meeting that was sponsored by Martin Bormann at Strasbourg in France, he held a meeting of all the major German industrialists that were to send representatives to the Hotel Maison Rouge in Strasbourg, and the meeting basically was outlining a plan whereby all the German corporations would create just literally hundreds of corporate fronts around the world. And then they were to have a Nazi party liaison officer in the corporations. This is very important. And, you know, to kind of oversee and control things. And the evacuation plan was designed to get liquidity out of Germany, in other words, massive amounts of cash began to move out of Germany into these foreign front corporations all around the world. Latin America, nationalist Spain, Sweden, Turkey, all of these countries that they were moving funds. But the other part of this evacuation plan, and this is where I think the story is really intriguing, they were also moving out patents, technical personnel, and so on and so forth. Now, after the war, the British and American governments in particular tried to close down a number of these things. They were successful in a limited number of cases in doing so. But if you really research the topic, the people involved in trying to shut this down admit that, you know, we've barely skimmed the surface here. And I'll tell you what the size, you can imagine the size and scale of this operation when you consider the fact that Bormann successfully moved about $800 million. That's in 1945 dollars. So in other words, we're talking today billions and billions of dollars into Argentina alone. And this money helped set up the Evita Perón Foundation, which gave Bormann, through Juan Perón and Evita Perón, basically control over all of this money just in Argentina. That's just Argentina. So this was a massive capital flight program. It was a massive technical flight program. And we have to remember another thing, another pattern that begins to show itself as the Nazis are doing this. Everybody thinks of Werner von Braun and Arthur Rudolph and Robertus Strughold, all of these scientists that came into this country under Operation Paperclip and then formed the nucleus of the American space program. Well, at the same time, the Nazis are driving the middle echelon managers and technicians to the Soviets. So in other words, we're getting the creme de la creme in this country. The Soviets are getting hundreds of these middle echelon managers and technicians and draftsmen and so on that are capable of reconstructing the documents trail for the Russians. So if you look at what the Nazis are doing, they're driving a division of the spoils that's almost equal so that they can set up the Cold War tensions afterwards. And this is a key component of the way this Nazi international functions, because they reasoned quite correctly that in that state of tension, they would have some maneuvering room to continue their own agendas. Now, it's quite the crucial point to understand what I'm saying here. What I'm saying, the implications of all of this are that you're dealing with far more than just Adolf Eichmann or Klaus Barbie or whoever hiding out in, you know, grass skirts and in grass huts in the Amazon basin. You're dealing quite literally with an extraterritorial state that's simply gone underground. It's jettisoned Germany, and now it's, you know, spread its tentacles all over the world, and incidentally into radical Islam. This is another connection that's very much a part of this story. But to give you an idea of what this organization was capable of accomplishing, in 1953, Juan Perón gave a press conference in Buenos Aires to which he invited all of the Latin American press corps. And he proceeded to announce that Argentina had solved the problem of the hydrogen bomb, you know, and this was 9 months before America had exploded its first hydrogen bomb. And then he introduces a German scientist by the name of Dr. Ronald Richter. And Richter proceeds to explain what he's doing, and then this whole project is roundly denounced in the world media by nuclear physicists that say, well, that's impossible. You know, you can't have nuclear reactions below a certain thermal gradient, you know, and Richter's talking about stuff way below, you know, what conventional thermonuclear chemistry suggested. Well, if you investigate Richter, and I do a rather thorough investigation of his claims in my book, The Nazi International, there was a reactor that they had set up that he had been building in southern Argentina near San Carlos de Bariloche and so on. And all of these scientists involved with the project had been brought over from, of course, from from Nazi Germany and basically formed a Nazi enclave in Argentina, continuing all of this advanced research. Now, I belabor this story because what this means is that this organization, if you stop and look at what's happening now, you've got vast sums of money, you've got a technology transfer, you've got patent flights and so on and so forth, and now you've got a bunch of Nazis basically using Argentina to continue some advanced research projects. So we're dealing with far more than just Nazis hiding out in Latin America and trying to escape the Mossad. You're dealing with an actual organized effort to continue some of their secret research. And this brings me back to the story of this flight capital program, because what the Nazis did is they drove certain technologies to the United States and the Soviet Union, but they kept the really good stuff for themselves. And that's what they were doing down there. They were researching all of this high technology and, using Argentina as a national front to do it. So it's a very, very important topic for people to understand. You're not dealing with the legend that has been driven into the public mind of just a few isolated Nazis. This was an organized effort. Now, the other thing that's very important that I've mentioned is this connection to radical Islam. This began during World War I with Baron von Oppenheim, and he persuaded the Kaiser to set up a branch within the German general staff to literally weaponize Islam. This was done in the case of the Ottoman Empire, and more importantly, in the case of Iran in Persia, where they basically short-circuited all of the movements within the Islamic world to reform the religion, bring it into the modern world and so on. So to a certain extent, you can even blame the current circumstances that we're facing to something going back to World War I. Well, this connection continues during World War II. You have the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, going to Germany during the war, promising to raise Muslim divisions for the Waffen-SS to fight the godless communists and so on and so forth. That establishes a link then between the Nazis and the Muslim Brotherhood. This will persist after the war, when you find Hjalmar Schacht and Otto Skorzeny and all of these Nazis in Egypt fomenting the overthrow of King Farouk for the CIA. And that brings me to the next component that we have to be very, very careful to remember. When the war ends, a German general by the name of Reinhard Gehlen, who is in charge of a German military intelligence unit called Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, that was the military intelligence for the entire Wehrmacht in all of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So in other words, this was a very large military intelligence operation. Well, General Gehlen, and to this day, I'm just stunned at this story. I cannot believe the massive chutzpah of this guy, because he approaches the Americans and says, okay, we're losing the war. We know that there's going to be tension between you guys and the Soviet Union. So I'll cut a deal with you. You leave my military intelligence unit in place, and I will provide you intelligence on the Soviet bloc. And in return for that, you fund us. And if you stop and think now, Dr. Horton, what he's just done, because the Americans accepted this deal, believe it or not. And what he's just done is he's rolled over Nazi military intelligence into the CIA. Okay, which becomes the CIA's, human intelligence network on the ground in the Warsaw Pact and inside the Soviet Union. So, and this guy was actually given a big banquet when he, before he retired, by the CIA in Washington, D.C. General Gehlen's outfit, you mentioned talking about sensing this pervasive Nazi presence in post-war Europe. Well, General Galen's outfit simply is rolled over and becomes, and please note my choice of words there, becomes the post-war West German Nachrichtendienst. So in other words, modern German intelligence is nothing but the old Nazi military intelligence unit on the Eastern Front that's been given a new name.
You know, now that you mention it, one of the things that I didn't know and was somebody drew my attention to, as it turns out, after I left Oxford, I went back to Germany to join my husband, who had a job there at the research site, Daisy. And then we moved down to Munich when we changed jobs. And, you know, I don't think this was coincidence, but we ended up living in Munich zone, which I just by accident found out is just a stone's throw away from Pullach, which is where the BND is. Yes. So when I looked on the map, I was just looking on Google Maps to find the way to the closest supermarket. And there's literally next to me the Death Star, almost at the end of my street. But more interestingly than that, there's also 3 buildings I would like to draw people's attention to. If you go to Google Maps and actually have a look at the Bundesnachrichtendienst, let me just bring it up, Bundesnachrichtendienst in Pullach, you can find it on Google Maps, and you can also find 3 buildings that strikingly look like swastikas. And this just cannot be coincidence. Actually, let me show you. So, because otherwise people will not believe me. So you have the Bundesnachrichtendienst of Foreign. So this is Bundesnachrichtendienst in Pullach, south of Munich. And then you have these 3 buildings. Let me just zoom in. Just like, how many swastikas do you see?
Oh, I see 3.
Yes, exactly. And then when people look at the building of the oh, sorry, by the way, I'm not sure if people saw when I shared my screen, because I realized that the focus was on your screen here. So this is the Bundesnachrichtendienst here in Pullach, and there are 3 big fat swastikas. And they are right on the territory of the Bundesnachrichtendienst. And I think the original building, which is one of these, fancier looking buildings, is one that was also used by Hitler as a HQ.
Well, I've got a little addendum to your story, because when Galen set up the headquarters for the BND in Pullach, he moved into a large house, and guess whose house it had been? Martin Bormann.
Oh boy. This is just so incredible. I mean, also, if people look up the building of the domestic intelligence in Germany, the what would have been, I think, Staatssicherheit, SS, so state security, the modern building of the Verfassungsschutz has 2 S's in it. The 2 lighting. It's just absolutely unbelievable. One of the things that I ask myself when I hear the story about the huge capital flight, I mean, people make the point, and also Catherine Austin Fitz makes the point, that money doesn't tend to get lost. It doesn't puff into thin air. And also, moving those quantities of money shows up. I mean, at some point, you have to move wads of cash, or else you are moving bars of gold. So, how could it have been that, ostensibly he smuggled out the 800 billion, or how much it was, to Argentina, but in real terms, it must have been known to the entire international community that the money is going there, right?
Well, I think it was known at least to certain prime banks in the West, and here's why. In my book, The Nazi International, I reference a study called the book was called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. It was written by an American journalist by the name of Paul Manning. And Paul Manning was a close associate and friend of the then CBS anchorman, Ed Murrow. All right. So in other words, you're dealing with someone fairly high up in the CBS media hierarchy. And he was in turn friends with Ladislas Farrago. And I'm sure I'm butchering the Hungarian name there, but Farrago wrote a book called Aftermath, Martin Bormann and the Rise of the Fourth Reich, in which he referred to Argentine Central Intelligence Agency documents that proved that the Argentinian secret services had Bormann under surveillance in Latin America. And he was roundly denounced in the Western press for this book. because, of course, Bormann was supposed to have died in Berlin. But when you research how Bormann was supposed to have died, you discover, well, he died in two different places under two different circumstances. So, we're back to Hitler dying in the bunker again. We're supposed to believe a bunch of Nazis are started after 12 years to start telling the truth, about that whole episode. But Manning went down to Argentina and picked up on the trail that Farrell had outlined in his book. And then he discovered something truly astonishing. He discovered that in the early 1960s, a check for several $1 million that had been drawn on Chase Manhattan Bank and National Hanover Bank in the United States, and it had cleared through Deutsche Bank in Buenos Aires, and the check was written over Martin Bormann's own signature. I mean, there it is, Martin Bormann. And he was stunned, of course, and he took his galley, his manuscript, to Allen Dulles, the head of the American CIA at the time, and showed him. And he remarks about this in the beginning of his book. And Dulles, the only thing that Dulles said was, well, you're on the right trail. You're on the right track. So, yeah, I do think that this was monitored. And I even go further in my book, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, because let's look at the Bilderbergers for a moment. Here you have something that's set up by Lawrence and David Rockefeller, and of course the Rothschilds, representing the Anglo-American interests. But who do you have setting up these meetings on the European side of things? Well, you have Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Who's Prince Bernhard? Well, he's a German nobleman. He had been a kind of a middle echelon manager working for IG Farben. Okay. And then some of the principal people that were invited to these early Bilderberg meetings was always, without fail, Dr. Hermann Josef Ops. So who's Dr. Ops? Well, Dr. Ops at the time is the CEO of Deutsche Bank. But during the war, and this just floors me, during the war, Dr. Ops was the head of a small handling bank in Berlin that was the bank of accounts for the Reich government. So in other words, Dr. Ops was the guy signing Adolf Hitler's paycheck as Reichskanzler in Germany. So in other words, what I think, if you look at the financial interests represented in the Bilderberg meetings in those early years, is that you have clear indications that this is a network that's being formed to control all of this Axis loot, move it into those Western banks as a secret reserve, and then take that money and shovel it all back to Europe in the form of American aid. And, the banks get their cut on the way. That's what it looks like to me. Because the connections of the people on the European side in these meetings just go all the way back to the Nazis and to their finances. The other thing we need to remember, since you're in Switzerland, is that the Bank of International Settlements was the brainchild of, at one time, the president of the German Reichsbank, Dr. Hjalmar Schacht. And Schacht sets up this central bank for central banks. And in the charter, the bank is given sovereign immunity. In other words, they create a bank with the same sort of protections in international law as a country. Okay. And during the war, the Nazis placed several IG Farben board members on the board of the Bank of International Settlements, so that they were basically in control of it. So they're moving money in and out of Europe through the Bank of International Settlements faster than you can bat an eye. It's it's truly incredible. It's a network, and it's a very deep network.
One question I have is because when you mentioned that Deutsche Bank was it in Buenos Aires? They had a branch. So, we're looking for an international network that can move large amounts of money without it showing up. And there we have the banking system that was already global.
Yes.
And in these days, we wake up to the situation that's known to people in finance, which is that there are no separate banks. There are no separate central banks. They're all privately owned, and they all go back to exactly what you said, the Bank of International Settlements in Basel.
Yep.
And it looks like, if in terms of systems analysis, if you have one big monopoly, one really global big behemoth, that doesn't just come about last week. It has to have grown. So I would say, given the size, we can be sure that already during the Second World War and beforehand, there already was a global banking cartel. And one bank that we know now already existed back then. And to me, it sounds like it's the one bank moving money from this branch office to that branch office and doing, this kind of Italian game where you have to guess where the ball is on the three cups. And it's kind of this sort of shuffling around. And my question would be, if Hitler draws a salary and this guy is signing it, is he not Hitler's employer who's really paying him potentially from Switzerland to do the job?
Yeah, sure. Exactly. If you look at the rise of Hitler inside of Germany, the people backing him are the big industrialists, Fritz Thyssen and Alfred Krupp and people like this. So it's a very clear pattern. And I should point out that the two individuals that more or less hooked Hitler up with the industrialists were Hjalmar Schacht and Rudolf Hess. So this is a clear pattern there. The end of World War I really didn't change anything about the German deep state. They got rid of the Kaiser, they got rid of the figurehead, but the rest of that structure was left entirely intact. And even after World War II, and this is something that most people don't know, that I mentioned in the Nazi International, IG Farben was such a gigantic corporation that it was only finally liquidated in the year 2003.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That is it just blows my mind. So basically it has been with us all along, and then when it's liquidated, I would bet that it's just renamed. It's a different fund.
Well, remember what IG Farben was: Bayerische Aniline Soda Fabrik and Bayer, and there was another chemical combine that went into creation of IG Farben. Well, look at the modern German chemical industry, and the quote unquote subsidiaries of IG Farben are still in existence. So, they got rid of the cartel agreement, but the companies comprising it are still there. and incidentally, they're huge backers of Chancellor Kohl, and then of Angela Merkel, President Sarkozy in France, and so on and so forth. If you scratch and sniff long enough behind particularly German and French politicians, you're going to find those big German chemicals cartels.
And also the other question that it popped into my mind as you were speaking is, are any of these two, Schacht and Hess, who played such a big role, are any of them by any chance Swiss?
Yes. In my 9/11 book, the 9/11 book is called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. I go into the Nazi connection behind 9/11 because, believe it or not, there is one. And let me briefly outline what it is so that I can get to Switzerland. The hijacker that we all associate with 9/11, the pictures were on every television screen. It was Mohammed Atta. All right. But if you dig into Mohammed Atta, you're going to find something very peculiar. Number one, when he's in this country, he did not act or behave like a pious Muslim. And rather, he's going to drinking parties, he's taking drugs, he's going to nudie bars and going out to Las Vegas, the whole debauched American lifestyle. Well, he was recruited in Cairo by a couple of Germans, and we don't know to this day who these Germans are. He then moves from Cairo to Germany. He spoke fluent German. He spoke Arabic, of course. He spoke Hebrew. you know, so he moves to Germany, where he lives in Hamburg for a number of years in the middle class area of Hamburg. And again, we don't know who his sponsors are, except we do know that while he's in Germany, he's being sponsored, here it comes, by the Karl Duisberg Gesellschaft. Well, if you look who Karl Duisberg is, he's president of Bayer during World War I and after World War I, and he's one of the movers and shakers that sets up IG Farben, okay? So here we have an IG Farben connection to Mohammed Atta, and I said, well, that's peculiar. So I started digging a little more, and I found something that just absolutely floored me, because in Switzerland, there was a banker by the name of Francois Genoud. And this character was quite literally the Nazi banker in Switzerland. He was handling all of the post-war accounts in Swiss banks for the Nazis. He had the power of attorney for the Goebbels estate. He had the power of attorney for Adolf Hitler. He was handling the party finances in Switzerland for the Nazi party. And incidentally, he was the banker that put the bin Laden family in contact with Deutsche Bank. Okay. So yeah, there's a little Nazi connection there that people are not talking about. So if you wonder about all those Deutsche Bank puts and shorts on the stock market in this country prior to 9/11, you know, my guess is maybe that had something to do with it. Yeah.
That is incredible. But also, Mohammed Atta, speaking so many languages, including Hebrew, to me, and then getting involved with something like that, to me, and it immediately implies he must have been a special agent of the intelligence agencies, no? A trained agent?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's every indication, and I go into some detail in that book about the strange behavior of Atta and his associates on the day of 9/11, because it's just bizarre. It's not behavior that you would associate with people that are going to fly airplanes into buildings, because at one point they actually take they drive from Boston up to Portland, Maine. They take a connecting flight from Portland back to Boston. Well, you know, if you're running an operation where you have to be on time and you're going to jeopardize the operation by adding a link in the chain where that connecting flight may have been late. In other words, this does not make sense to me. In fact, most of the official narrative does not make sense to me. And then Atta, you know, his luggage is conveniently not loaded onto the connecting flight, so that the FBI can conveniently find it and conveniently find a last will and testament in there. And then Atta does something that no pious Muslim would do, by writing documents in the name of Allah the Merciful and Muhammad his prophet and my family. You know, no Muslim is going to write such a thing, because that would be blasphemous. So in other words, you know, get your story straight, guys. If you're going to have Muslim hijackers, you know, slamming planes into buildings, at least understand their conventional pieties before you fabricate a document. So yeah, there's just lots to this whole story. But to me, the part of 9/11 that does not get talked about nearly enough is this connection of Mohammed Atta to all of these mysterious Germans that we still don't know who they are, and the fact that he's being sponsored by a society named after one of the founders of IG Farben. You know, to me, I don't know about you, but to me, that puts the meter right into the red zone. The suspicion meter is right in the red zone on that one.
Actually, just on the evidence that you know, you have just recounted here, it's already a deductive chain right in front of our nose, because first of all, everything about Atta implies that he's part of the intelligence agencies, a trained agent, speaks many languages, and so on. Then also, I would like to say that the same monopolization that created the one bank also created what I call the one agency, which is this growing together of all the intelligence agencies globally into this one surveillance agency. So if you're a member of the KGB or the CIA, you're pretty much working for the same company. And then when we put it all together, you think, well, who owns the intelligence agencies? It's the people with the money. So it's the banking cartel who owns the intelligence agencies. And as soon as you factor that in, you think, okay, every single agent on the planet must be in the employ of this global corporation. So in other words, if you take a flight and you are about to be used as an agent to pull off something, you can rely on the fact that your plane will be on time, because the banking cartel that wants to pull this off already owns all the planes. So if you're part of their big plan, they will make sure that your plane will be taking off and your luggage will be left behind. I mean, this is just extraordinary, you know?
Well, that's possible, but in intelligence operations planning, the more variables you add into, the more moving parts you add to it, the more the chance is that something's going wrong and would upset the timetable. So I think exactly the opposite. I think that this little stint up to Portland was perhaps a bit of deliberate planning, let's say, to misdirect people's attention to a certain thing, namely Mohammed Atta and that whole story. Because there's another very peculiar fact about Atta that I did not mention, and that is when he's in Florida, he's being visited, not by a bunch of Arabs coming over and, trying to keep him in the faith and so on and so forth. But most of the people that he is being visited by are coming from Europe. They're coming from Switzerland. They're coming from Holland. They're coming from Germany. And they have names like Peter and Hans and Jürgen. So yeah, I do think you're right. He's got all of the fingerprints of these intelligence agencies, but which one? Who's running him? Is it the BND? Is it the Mossad? Is it the CIA? We don't know. But I do suspect that you're onto something when you point out that at a certain level, these intelligence agencies are all networked with each other, because prior to 9/11 in Pravda, a Russian economist, an associate of President Putin, a Russian economist by the name of Dr. Tatiana Koryagina, ran an op-ed piece in Pravda where she said, this I think was in July, so a couple of months before 9/11, where she said that the United States would shortly and soon suffer a major attack on its own soil, but that the attack was going to come from a small international network, or, let's use the word cabal of people. And then she went on to say, which has resources in excess of $300 trillion to carry out their plans and remake the world the way they want to make it. So in other words, she was saying that this attack was not being launched by Islam. It was not being launched by Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or any of these, fall guys, but that there was an international cabal that was really behind this. So yeah, you look at that statement, and then you look at Mohammed Atta and all of these very bizarre and strange connections, especially to the Carl Duisberg Society, and you have to wonder, just exactly what's going on. And in my opinion, 9/11, getting into the physics here, the collapse of the Twin Towers to me is the key to this, because, to establish who the murderer is, you have to establish what the murder weapon was. So it's the mechanism of the towers collapse here that becomes all important to determine just who is doing what and why. And I get into great length in that particular book about the mechanism, because in my estimation, Dr. Horton, what you're looking at is a a multitude of mechanisms. We're in the Agatha Christie Murder on the Orient Express scenario, where everybody's got a motive for the murder and everybody's using a different murder weapon. And the detective finally figures out, well, everybody murdered it, but everybody had their own motivations. So there's several mechanisms in play that bring the Twin Towers down, not just one. And depending on who what the mechanism is, it's pointing to an ever narrower circle. This is the key. Conventional demolitions, that's a fairly wide expertise pool that you can draw from. If you start talking about nanothermite, then the people with access and the technical ability to use it narrows, and there's some evidence for that. If you narrow it even further to so-called mini nukes, and there are evidences that some sort of nuclear event occurred that day, that circle becomes even narrower. And then if you talk about exotic energy weapons, which I think is definitely one of the modalities involved, that circle becomes even narrower. And it's with that last component that you're in the territory of Nazi International, high-tech weapons, American Black projects, research, and so on. So yeah, I think several mechanisms, and those mechanisms point to different levels in the event.
I'm so glad you pointed this out, because as some people maybe know, the 9/11 truth movement has been fractured into individual creeds. Some people believe it's mini nukes, some people talk about nanothermite, and some people talk about the type of modern weaponry that Dr. Judy Wood, but as I understand also others before her or alongside her, also publicized. And I naively always thought that if I want to pull off something quite that big, I would want, as a physicist or engineer, I would want to have redundancy. Yes. So I want to know that one way or another, I could bring this thing down, maybe not completely demolish it completely. And then, and I wonder if maybe these different elements were also used to make, break material down and make it disappear and compactify it and so on and so on to be able to pull it off quite so spectacularly. Because the one I remember is Dr. Judy Wood. She pointed out that the amount of material that arrived on the floor was nothing like what started falling at the top. Exactly. So if we think back to the Twin Towers, what I would expect is just, a crunching back of floors, and in the end you end up with a stack of toast bread, with the different floors. But at the end of the fall, so-called fall, there was barely anything arriving on the ground. So it was pretty much dustified, or another way to call it is vaporized. As soon as you start vaporizing large quantities of stuff, you're looking at electromagnetic resonance of very high electromagnetic current.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned the magic word resonance, because for me, this is the key. Because Dr. Wood, has on her website and in her book has posted pictures of what she's calling the toasted cars. Well, you look at these cars, some of which are as much as a mile away from the actual ground zero, which I think is explainable by microwaves bouncing around, inside the canyons of New York City. And you look at these cars and you'll see the engine block is just totally burnt to a crisp, and then the rear end of the car is pristine, like it just rolled off the car lot. And to me, that's a resonance effect. There's no way to explain that by ambient heat or any of the other nonsense that people have been proposing. This is a resonance effect, and it's electromagnetic in nature. So yeah, I do think that was one of the modalities. But to me, what that indicates is my hypothesis from the day of 9/11 forward was always that there were 3 levels, not just 2. In the operation, you had a rogue element within the United States clearly involved, and they were attempting to create a false flag operation in order to project American power into the Middle East. But I think that the operation was penetrated by an even deeper level that reveals its presence that day by 2 means. And one is possession of American top secret codes, and the second is in the fashion that the towers come down, which would have indicated to level 2 that somebody else is out there and they've got some very, very sophisticated technology. So at that point, level 2 is pinned and they have to go ahead with the operation. it's a different way of analysis. But I do think, quite rightly, as you point out, that the fracturing of the 9/11 truth community over the mechanism of the destruction of the towers has been one of the key assumptions that has been made, that there's only one mechanism in play that day, that has distorted their analysis of what's actually going on. So I'm in complete agreement with you. That's actually the hypothesis that I'm proposing in the book, is that there's several mechanisms, they're all in play, and the mechanisms indicate different players with their own agendas.
That one makes sense, because one of the core principles of the intelligence agencies who are involved in this big time have to be is always compartmentalization. So within their own people, if you have three mechanisms, three modalities, you can kind of keep people busy, make them feel important, thinking that they are leading that particular project, but then they don't know that there's actually another layer of another team, maybe with more powerful weaponry.
Right.
So it just fits the entire narrative perfectly. Actually, I'm sorry. Before we, I'm so excited that we jumped ahead to 9/11, because it goes right to the heart of it, with the Nazi financing and how it has become very overt and obvious to us today that Nazi International is still at work. There's one question that goes right back to the 1940s that still bugs me. And one of the things I never understood as a kid, going to Germany and attending the school system. So I come from Transylvania, where, I once had a competition with a Welsh guy, and he said, Wales is full of castles. And he kind of, with disdain in his face, he looked at me and he says, do you have any castles in Transylvania? And I said, well, we're up to our neck. We're up to our neck in castles, Ted. I'm sorry, to tell you. So, we always had some sort of castles and, various parts of aristocracy in Europe, Eastern Europe. One part of the aristocracy has always been an element of defense. And in Eastern Europe, that was particularly important, because you always had, the Turks or some golden horde or some crazy, maniacs, mercenaries from all around the world coming into your region. So aristocracy had a very clear defense mechanism. Now, when I look at Germany, and the narrative that we're being sold is that you had a poor Austrian painter come into Germany and then top trump the entire German aristocracy and say, hey guys, this is what we're going to do. It's a crackpot plan, but we're going to pull through with it. And even as you can see your population dying, you'll still be behind me. That just doesn't add up, does it? So who the hell was Hitler, really?
I do think that there is every evidence that Hitler is the front man for, as I said before, the German deep state, which is left intact after the Kaiser's abdication in World War I. And that deep state, if you really look at, since we're talking in terms of aristocracy and historical traditions, well, that component of the German deep state, we're not talking about the industrialists and the bankers and all that now, but that component of the German deep state goes back to the Junkers, to the Teutonic Order, and so on and so forth. And it's very, very deeply entrenched in Prussia. And as we know, Prussia is basically the power that unifies Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. So that element is definitely present and continues its presence and operation even after the Kaiser's abdication. And we have to remember something about the Kaiser. The Kaiser, by dint of being the head of the House of Hohenzollern, is also therefore the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. So, even in exile, he's still in contact with that element of the German deep state. And this is what allows him, he held daily briefings right up until his death on what was going on in Europe. And it was that fact that he still plugged into that aristocratic network in East Prussia that allows him to do this. So this is another very, very important feature of what's going on, I think, between the wars. And you see this factor even in the way that the German military managed to survive. And, literally overnight, Hitler takes power and bam, we've got the Wehrmacht. Well, how does that happen? Well, it happens because General Oberst Colonel General von Seeckt, who was the head of the Reichswehr between the wars, deliberately created a cadre army. In other words, he took that 100,000 man army that he was permitted under the Treaty of Versailles and trained the daylights out of it for the eventuality that when Germany did rearm, that 100,000 men was all promoted and they became the officer corps for the new German army. And, you know, it was quite effective, as we know. So Seeckt represents this connection between the wars to that aristocratic element in Prussia, because this is what he was. He was a Junker. And he continues that whole tradition between the wars. And so I think Hitler, to a certain extent, you look at Adolf Hitler and he comes along and they stage the beer hall putsch, and he's thrown into Landsberg prison with Rudolf Hess, and they're being visited, you know, on a regular basis by General Haushofer of the German Geophysical Institute there in Munich. And Hess literally writes Mein Kampf for Hitler. It's not, you know, that's not Hitler's production. It's Hess's production, you know. So yeah, he's being steered and guided, you know, behind the scenes by some very, very powerful people. So again, I think you're absolutely correct. We have to look at the German deep state itself and question this public narrative that we've been fed, which I think, like you, is total nonsense.
One detail that I came across living in Munich zone, at some point I wandered into a bookshop, and there was a book about the quarter of Munich that I lived in, Zolln, which used to be a little village that grew into Munich. And I just bought the book on a whim because it was describing Munich Zolln in the time 1939 to 1945. So this was a time when the BND was already stalking the hell out of me in Munich Zolln. So I thought, it looks like a Nazi operation. Maybe I should learn a bit more about Nazis in Zolln. And what was in this book is that there was not just generals visiting Hitler. It was also somebody called in Germany the Hitler Mutter, which was ostensibly an elderly lady who took a liking to him and visited him in jail regularly. Now, this lady lived just down the street from where I had my flat, I think on what's called Diefenbachstraße in Munich Zone. And it's a very affluent area full of city villas. So this woman seemed to be very rich. She seemed to come from the old families. And she comes again from the town that is just a stone's throw away from what then becomes the Bundesnachrichtendienst. So to me, it indicates there must have been already an intelligence organization headquartered there that was operational. And I guess we should also remember that a lot of the aristocracy traditionally used to be in secret societies. You know?
Yes.
And another word for the secret services. And, the picture just, one question I have is, what happened to the Teutonic Order? What is it called today, and where is it?
Well, technically it still exists because, again, the Hohenzollern House still exists. And if I'm correct, I'd have to check on my files, but if I remember correctly, the title of Grand Master is still part of the titles of I forget who the current crown prince is, but it's still part of their title. So in some form or fashion, it does exist. But since you mentioned secret societies, let's look at the Thule Gesellschaft, because this is the secret society that's in Munich and functioning not only as a secret society, but as kind of a paramilitary group within Munich combating the Spartacists. And, it's definitely behind the beer hall putsch. But interestingly enough, the Thule Gesellschaft is the society that gives Nazism all of its occult trappings. The swastika logo was used by the Thule Gesellschaft. Members greeted each other with the greeting Heil und Sieg. And Rudolf Hess becomes a member of the Thule Gesellschaft. So it's from Hess that you get this influence. And again, Hess is a crucial figure. There's a book that is not up on my book site on the website called Hess and the Penguins, and it's about Hess and his flight to Great Britain, because he's a key crucial figure, and people overlook him. And to me, he's kind of the cosmopolitan Nazi. He's multilingual, he's upper middle class family, he's got business connections, he's a literate man, and so on and so forth. You look at the rest of the Nazi hierarchy, and probably the only person that would qualify as that sort of person would be Hermann Goering. But the rest of them, they're just pretty much thugs. But Hess is an interesting individual because he's the one that's funneling all of these ideas from that secret society into the Nazi Party. And if you look at the roster of members of the Thule Gesellschaft at the time that Hess joins, well, what do you find? You find people like the Prince von Thurn und Taxis, and you want to talk about a powerful, old, wealthy family. This family goes back to the Middle Ages and the banking families. The Italian branch of the family is Della Torre e Tasso. So in other words, there's an Italian branch of the family that's intimately connected to Venice. So you've got this whole network that's represented in the Thule Gesellschaft just by that one member alone. And trust me, there are other German nobility that were members of that secret society. And here, along comes Rudolf Hess. So again, to me, I think the picture is very clear. There is deep state involvement in the rise of the Nazi Party. No question about it. And for yet another connection, let's remember how Adolf Hitler himself got connected with the Nazis. He was assigned to spy on that movement by the German army. And that order probably came to Hitler via General von Epp in Bavaria, who in turn is answering to whom? General von Seeckt in Berlin. So you've got all of this network of connections that I think clearly indicate, again, that the German deep state is very definitely involved in promoting this movement to power.
One question I have is, given that the German element is so overwhelmingly strong, and it was the German, did you say the German army asking Hitler to spy? Why would they ask an Austrian, for goodness sake? Did they not have enough German Nazis in that society? Or, was Hitler somehow connected to German elements somehow by birth?
Hitler had maintained his contact with the Freikorps and so on after World War I, the Freikorps that began to arise in Germany. So he was connected with them. So he would make sense also from the standpoint as being an Austrian that volunteered to serve in the German army. They would have to look for somebody, especially given the fact that the Treaty of Versailles expressly forbade any Anschluss. And the reason it did, and this is overlooked by most histories of that treaty, the reason it did was that there was a very, very strong movement in Austria after World War I to unite with Germany. And they prohibited that by that provision of the treaty. So Hitler really is when he does annex Austria in 1938, he's really carrying out something that went all the way back to the end of the First World War. So I'm thinking that he would be a logical choice for the German army to infiltrate a movement that they're interested in and report back to Berlin. And eventually we know the story. Of course, he becomes the leader of the Nazi Party. And that's one of their platforms, that we want to reunite all Germans within the Greater Reich. So I think he's a logical choice from that point of view. There may have been many others, but they needed kind of an agent provocateur inside of the organization. He's a rabble rouser par excellence, so let's get this guy. But interestingly enough, the same has to be said of Rudolf Hess, because Rudolf Hess is himself a member of the Freikorps von Epp. We're back to General von Epp. And he's a member of that Freikorps. In fact, in my Hess book, I have a picture of Hess with other members of the Freikorps von Epp. So Hess is also a figure here that you have to look at as being perhaps yet another one of these individuals that was tapped to kind of keep tabs on things. And I clearly think that Hess, after the beer hall putsch in 1923, Hess originally flees to Austria, and then after Hitler is sentenced, is given that ridiculously light sentence in the Bavarian court, Hess comes back to Munich and stands trial himself, and he is sent to the very same prison as Adolf Hitler with a cell right next door. So in other words, it's like they're steering Hess, watch this guy, keep an eye on him. And, we know the rest of the story, that it's supposedly in Landsberg prison that Hitler dictates Mein Kampf, and Hess, the dutiful servant, is typing out what Hitler dictates, which again is BS. Hitler's original title for Mein Kampf was something monstrosity that was 4 years of fighting and struggle against the internet. This title went on and on and on. And it was Hess that suggested, no, that's that's never going to work. The title Mein Kampf was Hess's title. Wow. And if you read the book, it's a turgid, it's just bad, but certain chapters in it are very lucid, particularly the chapters on geopolitics, the Nazi movement. Well, those chapters in particular were Hess. He wrote those, not Hitler.
So one question I have, when you describe that and how Hess was smuggled into the prison and right next door and so on, to me, that is a classical signature of a senior handler being placed next to somebody who has to be handled.
Yep.
And then my question is, why, if you just have some, frankly, on the surface of it, an Austrian nobody, why would they have to go about with such care, handle him carefully and have him publish the book with all the drivel, but then slide in the stuff about geopolitics that's really important. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's almost like people are handling him with silky gloves, mm-hmm. like not to upset him too much. So to me, it sounds like Hess is the handler, but mm-hmm. he's handling somebody who was very important. Mm-hmm. Could it possibly be that Hitler's daddy was somehow connected to the banking empire in any way?
Yeah. Yeah, during the war in this country, a psychiatrist was hired by President Roosevelt to do a very top secret psychological profile of Hitler. The man's name was Langer, Langer. And after the war, he published, this secret file that had been compiled for Roosevelt. And the title of the book was The Mind of Adolf Hitler. And in the book, he mentions that there were several intelligence files that the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss had been compiling on Hitler prior to the Anschluss. And the files concerned the possibility that one of Hitler's ancestors, his grandfather, I believe, on his father's side, had sired illegitimate children by either a Rothschild family member or the maid of a Rothschild family member or whatever. And that Hitler was deathly afraid of his own Jewish background maybe having been exposed. And I find that this has perhaps some traction, because if you look at Martin Bormann, and let us remember who promotes Martin Bormann into his position of power. Well, it's Rudolf Hess that makes him his personal secretary. All right. So in other words, when Hess flies off to England and Martin Bormann takes over as Reichsleiter of the Nazi Party, he's just kind of stepping into the shoes of his boss. Okay. But Bormann, once he's in that position, and unbeknownst to Hitler, has his good buddy, Heinrich Miller, Gestapo Miller, do several secret investigations of his boss, Hitler. And I suspect that what Bormann may have been looking for was this information that he could use to Bormann, being the pig that he was, could use this information to blackmail Hitler. You're dealing with a pit of vipers here with these people. and Nothing would surprise me. So there is a bit of traction to that story. And, again, Hitler being an Austrian, perfect sort of individual to stir up Austrian sentiment, to create the greater German Reich. All of that goes back to the 19th century, and that's a part of history that Americans don't know too well. But you know the story, the struggle between Austria and Prussia for, who was going to unify Germany and how was it going to be done. So I think it's entirely possible what you're suggesting, that there may have been some secret that Hitler himself was trying to protect. And maybe that was the reason, one of the hidden reasons for the Anschluss. He wanted to get his hands on those files in the Austrian Chancery.
Well, one thing that really hits my ear and makes me kind of sit up and go like this is when you say that there are, possible indications that he might be an illegitimate, or his, grandfather and so on. There might be some lineage connections to the Rothschilds. I mean, that to me is a slam dunk, because if that were true, just assuming as a hypothesis, let's assume Hitler would be an illegitimate child, or, I'll say something more about that, but let's assume illegitimate child that has been placed somewhere in some family. He grows up, and we know that big banking families have this thing where they even use their illegitimate children to run parts of their big banking operations.
Yep.
If we make this assumption, in one move, we can explain why the entire German aristocracy had to shut up and make do, because everybody was banking with the Rothschilds. So if anybody didn't like the new Führer, they probably had their bank account closed down, or there's credit line cuts, I would assume.
That's an absolute possibility, and I'll tell you why. In 1934 or 5, I forget the exact year, a loan was floated to the Reich government, and I have pictures of this document. I'd have to dig and dig and dig to find it, but I've seen it. And at the bottom of the loan document, you see, of course, Adolf Hitler's signature as Reichskanzler. But you know who else is co-signing the document? Max Warburg.
Oh boy, Hamburg. That's the Hamburg banking family, is it not?
The Hamburg banking family. And with connections to the Warburg family in this country, in the form of Paul Warburg, nephew of Max Warburg, who is head of the Federal Reserve.
Oh boy, okay, slam dunk, right? I think we're on to a winner right there. I mean, this is, it's such a simple question to think, how did an Austrian painter, just suddenly trump the entire German aristocracy? Because the German aristocracy could have also, what a prestigious position to be the Führer. And then really you would have Germany wanting to have an Austrian Führer. I mean, how embarrassing, right? So, but of course, if this is the connection, everything would suddenly be explained. Also, for example, I think there's images where Hitler is visiting Zurich, for example, the banking, city. And my question would also be, is it perhaps the case that Rudolf, Hess himself was making regular trips to Switzerland? Is there anything recorded about that, of regular?
Hess, yes. Hess is one of these people that is trying to negotiate an end to the war between Germany and Britain after the fall of France. And there's every indication that Rudolf Hess undertook a number of very secret trips prior to his flight to Great Britain, to Switzerland, to nationalist Spain, where apparently he may have actually met with British diplomatic people in Madrid. So he's got his hands in quite a few fires. But let's go back to Hitler the Austrian for a moment. If you look, and I get into this in another book of mine called The Third Way, the current structure of the European Union is almost point for point drawn from a study that was conducted by the German Reichsbank and by I.G. Farben in 1942. And I believe the title of the book, it was a series of very academic papers that were drawn up. What are we going to do after we win this war? Well, let's create a European federation that we can dominate. golly, what happened? But anyway, if you look at the study, I think it's called Großraumkartell or something like this, large space cartel. And the study is how to set up a European Union, and the principal focus of the study is how do they amalgamate the patent laws of the various countries. In Italy and Germany, when they signed the Axis Pact, they set up a joint commission to bring German and Italian patent law into sync. Well, this study, if you look at it, they decide that the way they're going to do this is do an end run around national legislatures, the Reichstag and the Estates Generales in France and so on and so forth, by creating a huge international regulatory bureaucracy. Does that sound familiar? That the German banks and cartels can dominate. Does that sound familiar? Is there a reason the European Central Bank is in Frankfurt and not Paris? Well, yeah. But the other thing to look at here is that when you look at these studies, and these ideas go back to World War I and German war aims in World War I to Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, who first kind of outlines very similar ideas, that Germany should create a European federation and bring in the French and the Italians and everybody that they're fighting. But the other thing that's key here to their thinking, their strategic thinking, is the whole concept of Mitteleuropa, Middle Europe, and a recreation essentially of the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, and then using that as an economic nucleus to drive the rest of Europe. Well, it's intriguing to me that when the Anschluss occurs in 1938, Hitler makes a beeline to the Hofburg. And what does he do in the Hofburg? Well, he gathers up all of the Habsburg crown jewels and takes them back to Munich. And the question is why? I mean, are the Nazis interested in protecting the Habsburg crown jewels for the Habsburgs? Well, no, probably not. I suspect, and this is going to sound totally nutty, Dr. Horton, but I suspect that what they were doing was, after the war, they were going to reinstitute a monarchy and use those crown jewels as a symbolization of the legitimacy of their reign over Europe, and use that as a symbolic tool to make the connection. There's even interesting rumors that were the subject of a recent movie about Kaiser Wilhelm, that the Nazis were trying to bring him back to Germany and use him as a way of uncovering the monarchists and so on and so forth. And, to his credit, Wilhelm refused. But I think every indication is there that they had plans for this Austrian, and the plans were much bigger than people can possibly imagine. And it goes back to this greater German Reich idea that was at the heart of the struggle between Austria and Prussia. Who's going to dominate it? And that's a key way of bringing the Austrians, fully and completely into the fold.
And that's another thing that's so interesting, because one of the things that we only just very lightly touched upon is the role of the secret societies and their power, and also their rituals. All this. Now, I'm bringing this up again. I'm kind of going back a few steps, but I think it's relevant to the entire crown jewel story in my mind, because when I have heard people indicate that, well, it could be that Hitler was somebody very important, and that made immediately sense to me. And then, if you now mention the Rothschilds, that immediately makes sense to me. But there's also something that we know now today about secret societies, and this is their rituals. And, a lot of secret societies are not just death cults, they're also sex cults. So they have sex rituals. So any children born from those sex rituals, which sometimes seems to be everybody with everybody pretty much, you know, these people would then be planted in foster families, be raised, and then be brought in almost like a neutral person who doesn't really belong to the cartel, but actually they are the children. And then, you know, the cartel can kind of hide behind this human facade, you know. It's the human equivalent of a front company. It's front children. Now, when I'm thinking about, okay, what if it's the Rothschilds? Now, the Rothschilds have also connection to London. So they're originally German, but they also own, as far as I can make out, you know, large parts of the city of London, you know, the banking part, certainly. And one of the things that's very interesting, talking about crown jewels, is that the City of London territory, very much like Washington, D.C., is a private extraterritorial territory that doesn't belong to the host country. Neither Washington, D.C., nor the City of London belongs to, you know, the host country. So, but then when you look at where the crown jewels are being stored, they're being stored in the Tower of London, which is the corner of the City of London. So in other words, and one people who don't know much about the UK probably don't know this, but every year there's a ritual whereby the Queen of England visits the City of London. Her bodyguards take her all the way up the Strand and then stop at the Temple Bar Dragon, dragon symbol. And then, you know, her bodyguards stay behind. She sits there for 20 minutes, like, you know, ordered and not picked up, and then eventually when the guild so deign, they pick her up with their own bodyguards and take her to the guild hall. I think that's your dog.
That's my dog. She's whining. Hang
he
on.
Probably wants a break fairly soon.
Shiloh, do you have to go outside? Yeah, I think. Can we take a break?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to take her outside. Okay, we'll take a break, and I'll try and address this if I can remember it when I get back.
Absolutely.
All right.
So we'll be back in a couple of minutes. So you know, just let us know.
All right. Hang on.
So in the meantime, I you know, maybe tell the backstory for those people who don't know, because I'm pretty sure that Dr. Farrell is familiar with this story. And so I found out about this. I can actually point people to the book because I think it's a very, very important investigative detail. So let me just bring up the hang on, where is it? There we are. Let me just bring up the actual book. It's called Treasure Island. So this is where you can read up about this, and you can find out that you can check that what I'm telling you is not just made up. If you go to, hang on, Treasure Island, and the author of this, hang on, it's to do with tax havens. Where's the book? I've just seen it here. Hang on, yes, Nicholas Shaxson, not Stevenson here. Let me just show you the book because it's very, very important. I really recommend for all those people who are wondering, you know, what's going on in the world, please do look into this book called Treasure Island, written by the journalist Nicholas Shaxson. Let me bring up his name. I think it's here at the bottom. There we are. And it's about tax havens and the men who stole the world. So already with this subtitle, you can guess that, you know, this is some really important stuff is going on in that book. But 2/3 through the book, I don't think, maybe I can show you inside. Maybe there's an index. Let's see. So you've got the contents here. And as we are going down, the fall of America, let's see, where is it? It's towards the end. The Griffin, yes, exactly. I think it's here in this section called The Griffin, the City of London Corporation, on page 244. If you go into that part of the book, you will find a description of the yearly ritual that the Queen of England undergoes, which is the one I just began to explain, which is that, so she, you know, resides in Buckingham Palace, and then she's being taken in a big, you know, flamboyant ceremony all the way up and all the way up the Strand. And then, and in front of the Royal Courts of Justice in London, you've got a stone, a temple. It's called Temple Bar because there used to be a bar, you know, and probably tax raised when you went from the UK, from England into the city of London, which was a private territory. So there used to be a bar, and at the Temple Bar, there's this dragon. And at the location of the dragon, the queen, you know, gets out of the carriage, is placed there without her bodyguards, has to wait for the guilds to pick her up, and then they take her to the sorry, let me just here we are. The guilds take her all the way to the guild hall. Now, this entire procession is televised, and the members of the guild are already in the guild hall waiting for the queen to arrive. And the journalist describes that, you know, in one of these rituals, sorry, I can see that Dr. FARRELL is back. I was just in your absence, I was just telling people about the ritual. And I just showed the book where it appears, which is Treasure Island by Nicholas Shaxson. Mm-hmm. And what happens in the book, Treasure Island, is that this journalist describes being invited to the Guild Hall, and there are big TV screens showing the televised event of the Queen arriving. And then the commentator, the BBC commentator, says how odd it is that the Queen is just sitting there without her bodyguards, waiting for 20 minutes. And it was very, and the commentator says, how strange that such a fairly undignified situation would arise for the Queen of England. And in the moment, there's just big, you know, laughter in the hall, as if everybody in the Guild Hall is in on a secret, and just the rest of the world doesn't know what it is. And I think the secret that the people in the Guild Hall are in on is that the crown jewels and the entire crown of England is owned wholesale by the city of London. And this is why the crown jewels are kept in the tower. Mm-hmm. And then occasionally when the Queen needs it, she borrows it. She borrows her own crown jewels from the tower. Would you agree with that, Dr. FARRELL?
Well, yeah, I think in its essential outlines that's probably the case. The problem here is that we in the alternative research community are kind of conditioned to thinking that it's all the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, as I like to call them, running the show. I think it's much more significant if we go back and look at the evolution of central banking in Europe, and then later, of course, United States, from the standpoint of its connection to these very old families. I mentioned the von Thurn and Taxis family earlier, the Italian branch della Torre e Tasso. The network, I think, traces back to Venice and to the Venetian nobility, because if you look at what begins to happen as Venice sees the handwriting on the wall and the inevitable decline of the Serenissima Repubblica, what they begin to do is very interesting. They begin to liquidate the public debt and to convert hard assets into liquid assets. And then these families, via the von Thurn and Taxis, the Fugger's family in Germany that Martin Luther railed against so much, they transfer these funds to another swamp, Amsterdam. And it's very intriguing to see the House of Orange and its connections to these other families. And again, you have this building of a banking hub in Amsterdam, and also Stockholm, which is a very similar sort of geographical location. And again, you have one of the first central banks being set up in Sweden. So you've got all of these connections, and then what happens? Well, you've got the overthrow, literally the regicide of King Charles I. In England, you have the long interregnum of the Long Parliament under Oliver Cromwell. And then what happens? Well, you have the Stuarts brought back in, Charles II, and after Charles II, then they've got a problem because he leaves no heir. So the problem is, we're going to bring over William Stadtholder from the House of Orange to this country. He's got to sign off on certain things that we, the British oligarchy, want, namely no more royal, lording it over everybody else. So William comes over, a Dutch king, House of Orange, and what's the first thing he does? Well, he and a bunch of his oligarch buddies set up the Bank of England in 1694. And of course, they're major stockholders in it. So it's not just the Rothschilds, it's not just the Rockefellers. You have much older families that I suspect are, the Rothschilds are kind of the public face. I suspect that you have much older families with much more actual wealth and real power than the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds are kind of Johnny-come-latelys on the scene, as are the Rockefellers. And knowing the way that the Venetian oligarchy operated, they were very careful about vetting newcomers into the circle. You kind of had to pass a vetting process. Are we going to let you in? And if we do, okay. If we don't, you're out. So I do think these banking families are much more complex than just kind of a monolithic Rothschild Rockefeller nexus. That's certainly there. But I think you also have to look at families like the Giustiniani in Italy, Della Torre Itasso in Italy, the Taxis family in Germany, which is still there, still very wealthy, still very powerful. So you have to look at families like that and their interconnections, and they're connected to everybody. The Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, House of Orange, it's a network.
Actually, the other thing that's also, if you want to investigate who really owns, large parts, one question to ask is, who owns Washington, D.C., and who owns the City of London territory?
Yeah.
And, when you asked this question about the City of London, I was trying to find out, and the furthest I could get was that the City of London, or the City of London Corporation's rights, because the corporation that owns the territory, go way back before William the Conqueror. So this is what, 1066,
Yes.
So
yes.
we need to look at owners who were around before 1066 and already owned a sizable, very wealthy, chunk of land. And it's London. I mean, it was always very rich, very powerful, and very important to trade as well. And I think another branch of investigation that we need to look at is when we're looking at for example, the International Bank of Settlements in Basel being created, as you described it, as an extraterritorial entity with the powers and the status in international law of a country. The Vatican has that sort of status.
Yes.
But and also an older version of that, of this kind of like free trade zone, you can do whatever you like within that, is I think also the Hansa cities, the
Yes.
Because and then maybe if you look at the Hanseatic League, as you were speaking, I was kind of because my history is absolutely atrociously bad, and I'm just learning it as we go along. One of the things that I looked at was just on Wikipedia, the Hanseatic League, and it was a North German league here. So it would explain why Stockholm, is also a very important part. And here is the down here, the Hansa proper, and here are places like Hamburg, but also further down are places like Stockholm. And it means that in these areas where Stockholm, I've just seen it somewhere. It's somewhere here. It just escaped my attention. But anyway, so in these places, you would have an accumulation of wealth and banking operations that would become, incredibly wealthy and would buy up real companies and would accumulate power. So I think we're looking at, you're probably right, not just the Rothschilds, it's also banking families that are maybe much more hidden than them behind the scenes. And I think, in systems analysis, the only thing I can say is that when you're building a monopoly and you're accumulating assets, size matters. So the biggest player 200 years ago would be the biggest player now. Or in other terms, if we're looking at the biggest players these days, are we looking for them? We can go back in history and say who was the wealthiest player before William the Conqueror. And I think my answer is it's probably the church, right? I mean, they own lands around the world. So would it be the Vatican behind all this?
Well, it would be a twofold thing. It depends on what kind of wealth you're looking at. Let's go, before I forget it, let me mention the Hanseatic League is formed in part by these North German free cities to combat the power and influence of the Teutonic Knights. So by the time that you get to the electors of Brandenburg, that eventually becomes the House of Hohenzollern, when they become Grand Masters of the Teutonic Order, and at the same time they're acquiring territories that were formerly a component of the Hanseatic League, what you see is the beginnings now of the modern German deep state, because they're integrating that old Teutonic Order, which continues more or less with the Junker class in Prussia, with those banking cities. This is a very clear pattern, and it's at that point, by the time of Frederick the Great, that integration is fairly complete, and it's a very powerful infrastructure that he has at his disposal. I mean, just look at the 7 Years' War and what he was able to pull off in that, because he had that infrastructure behind him. But let's go back to your question about the Middle Ages prior to William the Conqueror. It depends on the kind of wealth that you're looking at, because the Vatican certainly has hard assets, just all over the place. But the other kind of wealth that's beginning to surface at that time, again, is Venice and the idea of liquidity, wealth in the form of financial liquidity. And Venice is literally taking advantage of a special status, very much like the city of London, that it has within the Byzantine Empire, because it was granted by, I forget which emperor it was. It was granted a special status within the Byzantine Empire as kind of an autonomous province, and it was given special trading privileges within Constantinople and so on and so forth. So this is what enables the rise of Venice as a center of international banking at the time. The other thing I think you have to look at for the centers of wealth that begin to emerge after William the Conqueror are the northern Italian city-states, Florence, Padua, Genoa especially, the great rival of Venice, because again, their wealth is built not so much on land, but on financial liquidity, on their control, particularly in Venice's case, the control of bullion markets. Venice was able to manipulate, currency values throughout all of Europe simply by its ability to manipulate exchange rates between gold and silver. And that's a story I get into in Financial Vipers of Venice. So it's a very complex picture. And again, I think it takes us back to the problem that we're dealing with a very complex network. Certainly the Roman Catholic Church is involved in this. We've seen since Pope Leo XIII efforts on the part of the Vatican to rein in the independence of their own bank. And that, speaking of which, that bank is intimately tied to the Nazi flight capital program. It's intimately tied to the Japanese plunder of Asia, because Hirohito took some of those proceeds and stuck them in the Vatican Bank. So, it's it's a very complex picture. And for the Rockefeller-Rothschild nexus, the Vatican Bank represents the one major international banking institutions that they don't have their claws completely into. That's another huge problem for them. I do think that there's some evidence that the current Pope, Francis I, was placed in there kind of as a regime change operation by those people. But it's a very, very complex picture. And when you say Vatican Bank, the other problem that you have to look at are the Italian nobility that are closely associated with the papacy, the Nogara family, people like this, that have had a long-standing connection with the Vatican. And, you know, I'm mentioning families that most people haven't heard of, but they're there behind the scenes. And the reason you never hear from them or about them is that they're extraordinarily powerful.
Do you know, actually, when you're telling me this sort of, you know, you give me this map, the question that flashed through my mind is, if the old world order is pretty much the Vatican, is this why the Rothschild and Rockefeller endeavors are called the New World Order, because they are trying to break up the Vatican Bank? And is this why we're hearing so much about the pedophile scandals in the Vatican and the church to really break them down?
Yes, this is exactly why. This is the old struggle that manifests itself in the public mind as the struggle between Masonry and the Vatican. And that really, in my opinion, comes to a head with Vatican I, when papal infallibility is finally made a dogma de fide. And it's not just papal infallibility, but the other important thing that council decreed was that the Pope has a supreme, immediate, and universal jurisdiction. And those are technical terms of law. That means that the Pope has the authority to bypass the normal functioning. Immediate jurisdiction means that he has the ability to bypass the normal functioning of the hierarchy and intervene directly in the affairs of any individual Roman Catholic. Okay, supreme jurisdiction is obvious from the term, that it's a jurisdiction beyond which there are no jurisdictions to which you may appeal. The interesting thing about Pope Pius IX, who was Pope at the time that Vatican I occurred, is that there's a certain amount of evidence, which I get into in Financial Vipers of Venice, that he was a Pope that was placed there by those high Masonic powers, because there was considerable objection to those doctrines within the Roman Catholic Church at the time. Principally from Germany and Austria, but there were some objections from Italian cardinals and French cardinals and so on to the doctrine itself. So I think it's entirely possible that you, as you say, you're witnessing a struggle, an ongoing struggle to delegitimize the Vatican or take it over. That's been going on for quite some time. This goes all the way back to the 18th century and the struggles with the Bavarian Illuminati and so on and so forth. So it's a very old struggle. Right now, it looks like the banking Masonic party, let's call it that, is in the ascendancy and probably has been since Vatican II. So
if you're saying that the Vatican is being trumped by the Masons, who are the Masons? Who set them up? Because the only thing I know is that the Illuminati were set up by this guy Weishaupt, who seemed to have been funded by the Rothschilds. Is that right?
No, I don't think he was founded by the Rothschilds. That's a very interesting question. Weishaupt, and it's important for people to understand, he recruited people from all over Europe as part of the Illuminati. But the way he did it was he penetrated Masonic lodges. So in other words, he used a secret society and created a secret society within a secret society. Weishaupt is coming out of a certain trend that began to develop within Roman Catholicism all the way back with Dante and people like that, who had the idea that you could practice the natural virtues, not the religious virtues. You could practice the natural virtues that did not need divine grace to bring about a global order. You find that very clearly expressed in Dante. And as a result of that idea, which would be technically a heresy for traditional Roman Catholic doctrine, many of these people, very influential people, worked underground. And Weishaupt, I think, is coming out of that influence within Roman Catholicism. He's setting up essentially an order of perfectibilists, dukes, clergy, whoever that think that this idea is possible. And he infiltrates the Masonic lodges. When the Bavarian government shuts it down in 1786, I think it was, what the Bavarian government did, in a certain sense, was it scattered the Illuminati to the four winds. And Weishaupt himself ends up in Frankfurt. So there's your Rothschild connection. I think at that stage, it is fairly clear that that's where that connection began, but it did not begin with the original founding of the Illuminati order. This is coming from somewhere else. Some people suspect that because Weishaupt was a professor in a Jesuit seminary in Ingolstadt, that this was actually a Jesuit operation. Well, again, that's possible. I haven't seen any hard evidence to that fact. The order existed. We know that the order had a hidden influence in the early stages of the French Revolution, and so on and so forth. But after that, the document trail goes dark, and we're left to conjecture. But it's interesting that when Pius IX, Giovanni Cardinal Mastai Ferretti was his actual name, when he becomes Pope, there were people within the Roman Curia, and this was subsequently published, that suspected that he had been initiated in some sort of lodge in Philadelphia. And the problem there is people always think, well, Philadelphia, he never went to the United States. Well, the problem is the Illuminati had code names for every city in Europe. And Philadelphia could have been a code name for, a city in Europe as far as the Illuminati are concerned. So I tend to treat the story with some possibility of truth.
The question is, how would you describe the Illuminati compared to the Masons? Are they a more militant, a more aggressive arm?
Yes.
And okay, because one of the things I really struggle with as a systems analyst is I think, okay, there's the Vatican, you've got church land all around, for pretty much everywhere around the world these days, a very big operation. And what goes with a big operation like that is a huge intelligence agency. So you have massive Vatican intelligence operations absolutely everywhere. And then the question is, who are the intelligence agents? And some people say, it's the Jesuits, they are the enforcement arm and so on. And you have these recurring links to the Jesuits. Now, in the spy game, this whole running of groups and infiltrating of groups has been figured out, absolutely centuries ago. And one of the oldest tricks in the book is that you have one organization that you control. And then when you have, reactionary forces or you have more violent forces, you set up secretly an organization for them to kind of catch them in that pool. And then you control that organization as well. Yes. And for me, what really nails it is that at the size that Vatican intelligence must have been, I think it would have been impossible to start something new and it not being infiltrated sooner or later. So, if Weishaupt is a figure who is figuring all along, to me that indicates that he was bought, and paid for from day one, pretty much. Now, the question is, if you are telling me that they were involved in the early days of organizing the French Revolution, wouldn't you... If I were the Vatican and I wanted to, say, asset strip the French king, I would set up, a kind of like what we would call these days a Gladio style, militant organization sort of thing. It which very much sounds like the Illuminati. And I would kind of sieve my Masonic pool of people, and I would kind of gently, select the ones which are particularly conspiratorial and militant into the Illuminati, make them feel extra special, and use them as my special squad to set these things off.
That's possible. Again, there's no hard evidence in Weishaupt's case. I've tended to view Weishaupt as just kind of a mad, evil genius, out to dominate the world. But it's interesting to speculate here because, number one, when Weishaupt sets up the Illuminati order, in some of the papers that the Bavarian government seized, he made the claim for it, and when you reached a certain stage of initiation within the order, you were told that the order claimed for itself every sovereign right of a state. In other words, it had the power of life and death over its members. But the other interesting thing is that when you turn to the French Revolution, you mentioned asset stripping. And it's very interesting and intriguing to me. And no one, as far as I know, has ever done kind of an alternative history of the French Revolution and its aftermath, the Directorate and then the rise of Bonaparte and so on. But it's interesting because when the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre, Danton, all those people, assume power, one of the first things they do is they start issuing assignats, debt-free money.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. And what happens in the rest of Europe? Well, they explode with outrage that, you can't do this. And so what happens? Well, France finds itself at war with everybody, And as a result of this, the French, the Directorate, the Committee of Public Safety, and later the Directorate, create what they call a nation at war economy. They standardize armaments productions throughout all of France. So in other words, it's not one little cannon maker in Lyon making a particular size of cannon and another cannon maker in Toulouse making yet different sizes of cannon. Everything becomes standardized. So you really see in France the creation of the first kind of modern or proto-modern military industrial complex. And this is why it's so difficult, when Napoleon comes along. It's so difficult to defeat France because the whole nation is mobilized in the war effort. And this is a revolutionary thing that he kind of inherits. So there's this financial aspect to the French Revolution that I don't think has ever been adequately studied. And when you couple that to the fact that you've got all of these Masonic groups vying for power in the early stages of the revolution, the Duc d'Orléans and the Orleanists and so on, the Jacobins, most of them have their own secret society connections. And to me, the true telltale sign that something is going on here behind the scenes is Maurice de Talleyrand. Because if you look at this guy, he's a laicized Catholic bishop. He's the foreign minister for Louis XVI. He's the foreign minister for the Directorate. He's the foreign minister for Napoleon Bonaparte. And then he ends up being the foreign minister for the Bourbon Restoration at the Congress of Vienna. So this guy, you couldn't get rid of this guy and you never knew where he stood. But the fact that he's able to persist through several different changes of regime, some of them wildly ideologically opposed to each other, tells me there has to be a hidden hand. Now, I have never found evidence that de Talleyrand was a member of any of these secret societies. However, the important thing here to remember is de Talleyrand was the mastermind, so to speak, behind the expedition of Bonaparte to Egypt. And that's definitely a Masonic interest. So, and besides the fact that Napoleon is bringing along all these Masonic scholars with him to Egypt, not the least of which is Champollion, the Rosetta Stone, he's got all of these people in tow. So the way I've always looked at it is, this was some sort of hidden Masonic expedition, and also a way to try and get rid of this troublemaker, send him to Egypt, get him out of our hair. And, unfortunately, that expedition turned out to be at first very successful and then a disaster. And then the little corporal manages to make it back to France. So I've always suspected that there's a huge hidden hand in all of these events. To me, it's just too clear if you look at what's actually there in the public record. It's way too clear. Couple in secret societies, couple in the Illuminati and the affair of the necklace prior to the French Revolution, and there you go. There's something going on.
This is just incredible because so I don't know anything about the Talleyrand, but one of the ways to check, in my experience with these Masonic people, is you look at either their portraits, and as you were talking, I was just looking at a portrait of him online. Sometimes there are hidden symbols, but another way to check is to look at their graves, because usually in the graves they just blow it all open. It's like, here's the revelation, I've been one all along, there you go, in your face, sort of thing. And sometimes they have big family monuments and
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of decoration, and then you can actually tell who is behind this all. One of the things that I'm looking for is, I want to, when you are talking about a hidden hand, I would like to bring up an image which is very, very famous, and it's about the declarations of the rights of men that
Yes.
came out of the French Revolution. I'm just looking at a very a high enough resolution image of it. Let me see if I can find one, because one of the things that is absolutely striking. Yeah, here it is. Oh, perfect. Yes. So let me just share my screen and show you some details that I find absolutely breathtaking. So this is the declarations of the rights of man.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, that came out of the French Revolution. This is in 1789. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you look at the symbolism, you've got this, whatever, I probably don't use the right term, but it looks like a spear to me, this
Uh-huh.
harpoon kind of thing. Then you've got the red cap that was
That's
a recognition symbol in the French Revolution. But then you have this angel here on the right, and even back then people used to be predominantly right-handed, to look, so they would look to the right first, and this was known by painters. So the right side was very important. And you have this angel pointing down, maybe at the laws here, and then
mm-hmm.
pointing up, and there you have the all-seeing eye, pretty much
Yep.
the same one that appears on the $1 bill.
Yep.
So the hidden hand is right there. And then if there were any doubts, there is here the snake that bites its own tail.
Yep.
The cycle of revolution and the snake. Now, if you go to the Vatican, the people who followed me already are probably sick of hearing this, but if you're talking about the Vatican, one of the things that people need to know about is the Nervi Hall.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Big audience hall here.
Yep.
That oh, sorry, that's a YouTube link. But you can already see that it's the head of a snake.
Yes.
So you have the eyes of the snake here. You have these scales. You've got
Yep.
the tongue and the fangs. And then when you look at the building from the outside, it's
Yep.
literally the head of an emerging snake right in Vatican City.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, what to me, this the Declaration of the Rights of Men, this snake is pretty much the Vatican to me, is it not?
Well, I would say that the Vatican isn't necessarily a covert serpentine organization, but rather I would take the view of the late Father Malachi Martin, that it was penetrated by such a group. And if you read his books, they're quite astonishing, because this was a pervasive theme throughout all of his books, that the Roman Catholic Church had been penetrated. His last novel, Windswept House, the novel opens with Masonic rituals and sacrifices being performed simultaneously in Charleston, South Carolina, and in Rome. And the novel Vatican itself goes into even more breathtaking details, if you know enough about contemporary Roman Catholic Church history, to identify who the characters are. So I think the case is rather that, as the Masonic documents itself testify, and I mentioned one of these in Financial Vipers of Venice, it's called the Final Testament of Piccolo Tigre, who was one of these Italian mid-19th century revolutionary Freemasons, Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini, the leaders of Italian unification, were Masons. So I think that this rather represents a penetration of the Vatican. And incidentally, Malachi Martin himself points out that building, that when it was constructed under Paul VI, had clear symbolisms. So, you know, he was decades ahead of the curve here. Going back to the idea that there is something very suspicious going on in the French Revolution. On my website, if any of your listeners are members of my website, I have a webinar in there about the Louisiana Purchase. Because if you really dig into that history, again, it's very, very murky, and it goes into all sorts of directions. You've got Thomas Jefferson, a Mason, concluding a deal with Napoleon Bonaparte to buy Louisiana, and the whole purchase is being underwritten by a British bank at a time when Britain and France are at war. And the bonds being underwritten are sold, guess where? In Amsterdam.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so, you know, the Louisiana Purchase is yet another one of these things where you see these oligarchs moving and shaping things behind the scenes. And once again, there's a little de Talleyrand connection there too, if you're interested. But yeah, I think it's fairly clear. The Vatican, I do think, has been penetrated, because Vatican II was quite literally a revolution in the Roman Catholic Church. That was perpetrated, you know, if you study the history of that council, that was perpetrated by a group of people coming largely from southern Germany and Austria, that essentially hijacked the council, and then you ended up with this liturgical revolution. You know, I can't tell the Roman Catholic Church of my youth. What we have today certainly doesn't resemble it. And there's another Masonic connection there, because if you're familiar with the old Roman Catholic Mass, the Tridentine Mass, you know, the current Mass looks nothing like it. But there's a reason for that, because the archbishop that was placed in charge of creating the Novus Ordo Missae was a fellow by the name of Archbishop Annibale Bugnini. And Archbishop Bugnini, after the new Mass is created and forced down everybody's throats, and Paul VI signs off on it, Paul VI was informed that Archbishop Bugnini, and presented evidence that Archbishop Bugnini was, guess what, a Mason.
Boy.
And Paul VI, of course, was just horrified, because it's at that point that he made that famous statement, "The smoke of the Antichrist has entered the church." And he sent Archbishop Bugnini packing to be the apostolic nuncio to Iran. You know, essentially exiled him, you know, which is a part of the story that people don't hear about too much. But you know, it was too late by that point. So there was a revolution in the Roman Catholic Church, and then of course everybody else followed along. You know, the Lutherans, the Anglicans, they modernized and gutted their traditional liturgies and doctrine. And it's informative to note that big contributors to the World Council of Churches, to the National Council of Churches in this country are, guess who? The Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
boy.
Yeah.
This just blows my mind. You know, the one question I have is, at what time, what year are we talking about when you're talking about Vatican II?
Let's say 1961 to 65. I think the fourth session of the council closed in 1965. So it was over a period of 4 years, but the real revolution occurred in the very first session of the council, when you had the delegations from Austria and Germany basically hijack the council. They took all of the agenda that had been prepared by the Curia in Rome under John the 23rd's direction. They took that agenda and were successful in getting the bishops at the council to throw it out entirely. So in other words, the council had been prepared, and things were prepared for them to debate and discuss, and that whole agenda was thrown out. So they literally, the council at that point became, you know, a rolling council, and basically rammed through a bunch of reforms. And that in my mind is why the council took so long, you know, 4 years. So it was a revolution in the church. And then the interesting thing is that when John Paul I is elected, well, let's remember something about Cardinal Luciani. He was the patriarch of what? Venice. And he was elected Pope, and, you know, 30 days later is found dead under very suspicious circumstances. And he was apparently trying to clean out the Vatican Bank and the Masonic influence within the Curia, and ends up dead. So, you know, we're dealing, in my opinion, you're dealing with the same institution, but essentially a very different group of people in charge of it now, that really have no ties to traditional Roman Catholicism as we knew it before the council. You know, the Roman Catholicism of Pius XII. That's gone. It's gone.
That just, I mean, it blows my mind. I'm not a Catholic, but because they're such a huge force in the world, especially the Vatican Bank, I think it's important for everybody to understand what's going on, because their infighting is shaping world events. I have to say, this is absolutely mind blowing. I didn't have you know, any knowledge of this, and I have to say, I'm just blown away. I mean, you know, I think for my listeners, I didn't promise too much. I you know, promised you'll have a world expert here, and you can talk to Dr. Farrell about anything, and he will have encyclopedic knowledge. You know, the one thing I'm taking away is, so I'm just looking at the time, and I think we need to wrap up soon. But one of the things I'm taking away from all this is the recurring themes that we seem to come across over and over are, for example, the formation of extraterritorial territories where people or tax havens where people can do as they like. And the Vatican is one, Venice seemed to have been one, the Hanseatic League was one, City of London, Washington, D.C. And it seems to be like the same program over and over. And then there are also other institutions like that people maybe wouldn't naturally think of extraterritorial territories, which is the International Bank or Bank of International Settlements in Basel. So you have a building in a city that is an extraterritorial area. And another one that I would really love to talk to Dr. Farrell more about this is, for example, CERN, because
I was just going to suggest, yeah, there is an extraterritorial entity. Yeah, I talk about CERN in my book, The Third Way. And it's interesting that you're a physicist, because I'm not, obviously, but with my elementary school physics, I'm looking at this project, and to me the suspicions began when they turned the thing on for the first time, and they shut it down right away, and claimed that the cooling mechanisms, you know, for those gigantic magnets that they have in that thing. And I did research on some of those magnets and some of the detectors, Dr. Horton, and discovered that some of them are putting out magnetic fields around 8 Teslas. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, that's several times stronger than the local magnetic field of the planet. You know, it's just gigantic. And at that point, I began to wonder, well, is this thing really just about particle physics? Because I go back in the book to the papers that were published by a Hungarian Jewish electrical engineer between the wars by the name of Gabriel Krohn. Incidentally, he ends up in this country directing General Electric's research division. But he published a paper in 1935 that won him the Montefiore Prize at the University of Liège in Belgium. And this paper is a breathtaker, because what he says in the paper is, okay, we can take the tensor calculus and analyze any electrical circuit in terms of the higher dimensional mathematics in the tensor calculus. And we can use that in turn to explain the transients, the electrical transients that emerge, here it comes, in large networked electrical systems like CERN. And if you stop and think what he's really just said, is we can take all of that tensor calculus from general relativity and apply it to electrical circuits and design. He goes on to say we can design any electrical circuit that we want to by means of tensor calculus. So in other words, he's looking at all electrical systems as specific manifestations of a generalized electrical machine. And you simply manipulate the matrices in the tensor calculus to create whatever machine you want to do. So what he said is we can take the tensor calculus from general relativity, bring it right down here on the laboratory bench, and engineer higher dimensional circuits on the laboratory bench. That's a whopper. That's a whopper. Because he's telling you you can engineer space-time on the laboratory bench. You can create higher dimensional effects. Well, I began looking at CERN and thinking, oh my God, if you apply that kind of analysis to this machine, it's not about particle physics. It's about hyperdimensional physics, which particle physics has to be. But it's about higher dimensional physics in a much more macrocosmological sense. And I thought, okay, well, that's a wild hypothesis, hypothesis to be sure. And then, lo and behold, after the book gets published a couple of years later, CERN is finally coming out and admitting, yeah, we're looking for evidence of higher dimensions. So what I think you're looking at there is something much more than particle physics. And since we're talking about particle physics, the other part of the problem here is that, you know, they've set up massive computing power for CERN. CERN's the world's biggest user of the internet because of, you know, circulating all the findings from their experiments. But they've set up these massive computing power and designed algorithms in the computing machines to pull data for the scientists to look at. So in other words, the first pass, the first filter of all of those particle collisions is being analyzed by computers, and the computers are pulling out things to send to the scientists to look at. So I'm thinking, okay, why could you not then set up a layer of secret algorithms and funnel any anomalous results that you might be getting from these experiments, like evidence of massive torsion effects and so on, and funnel those to secret committees of scientists? And you could also do a third layer, because I'm thinking if you've got such massive magnetic fields buried in piezoelectric rock, as some of that collider is, then it's possible you might be getting magnetic resonance effects in the planet itself. And you might be getting also, by resonance effects, you might be getting some sort of response in the sun, all right, because the magnetospheres of the two bodies touch. So I'm thinking at a much deeper level, then you might have a secret data correlation experiment going on that's whenever that dang thing is turned on and they're running their protons around the Hadron Collider, that they're also looking at data correlations of effects in wider systems that they're not public about. And again, the thing that I think makes that possible is if you go back to when they were first getting ready to turn CERN on, you had a number of scientists in Germany and in this country that were concerned about the possibility that they might produce a quark gluon plasma, you know, kind of a mini black hole. And they were attempting to litigate in court to stop it from being turned on, because they were claiming this is not all, you know, it's about more than particle physics. And they were trying to stop it from being turned on. Well, as it turned out, the courts wouldn't hear the cases because they didn't have any standing before the courts. And why didn't they have any standing? Voila, CERN is a sovereign entity.
Exactly. Yeah. You know what?
So, I don't know if any of that speculation makes any sense or not, but that's my thinking behind it.
So you see, if you have the time, Dr. Farrell, I can tell you right now what I know about this sort of stuff, everything I know, and then you can, we can start thinking about it. Because so let me start in the beginning. So ab ovo, I would like to say that I came to learn that Oxford is not what I thought Oxford was. It's not a place of higher learning. These are private intelligence agencies run by the City of London Corporation. This is what my current understanding is. I thought that that CERN was an international research project focused mostly on high energy physics, and then there were other smaller projects. By now, I suspect that this is also not true, and I have personal evidence that I was experimented on using military technology while at CERN, and it had nothing to do with my particle physics work. In fact, many times I felt like what I did in particle physics people couldn't care less, and there was another agenda that was sometimes used on me. Now, what do I know concretely? Concretely, one of the things I can tell you is that, for example, and so if you talk about the size of magnetic fields, I think the Earth magnetic field is what, 10 to the minus 4 Tesla. That's the number I've got in my mind. So when we're talking about 1 Tesla, 10 to the minus 4 is, you've got 4 decimal places. So 10 to the minus 4, if you've got 1 Tesla, we're talking about 100,000 times the size of the Earth magnetic field. Did I screw up my orders of magnitude?
I think it's 10,000.
10,000. Okay, 10,000. Of course, 10 to the minus 4. 10. Yeah, sorry. I am already thinking at the next thought, and I was shot in the head, and my brain is frazzled. I should also say, as I'm sitting here, I'm being microwaved from my neighbor to the east and my neighbor to the north. So I'm glad I can even speak in full sentences. But it goes right to exactly the criminality I'm facing here is also criminality I faced at CERN as a research scientist, because some very odd things started happening. There were 2 very, very odd things. Number one is that at some point, I had this mysterious disease that started exactly 3 days before my Viva. So I already started being a research scientist, and I hadn't done my Viva, but I had already submitted my PhD. So I had to travel back to Oxford to finish my Viva. It happens. In academia, that's normal. And I had this mysterious disease that started 3 days before the Viva, which is that my entire saliva and ear tear production dried up. Now, for the people who don't know about that, it's absolutely agonizing and torturous, because I was running around with a bottle of water nonstop and sipping from it, because otherwise my tongue would dry up. I didn't have any tear liquid, and every time I blinked, I could literally hear myself blink, because like a cartoon. It was horrific, but so it was very high stress just before my Viva. And then that mysterious disease that people couldn't really, diagnose lasted about eight months and disappeared when I came back from CERN. It just went poof. It went literally poof, exactly as it had appeared. And it was totally undiagnosed and hasn't come back. That was something very odd, where I felt, now looking back, I'm 100% sure that it was the intelligence agencies running medical experiments on me. But then something other and very curious thing happened. And I think this is an actual real evidence I have of experiments going on at CERN that are in the CERN region that have nothing to do with physics, which is that a few weeks before coming back to Oxford, I went to go shopping, and we used to live on the French side. So if you work at CERN, you can choose to live on the Swiss side, which is very expensive, or on the French side. So I lived on the French side, and if you wanted to go to a nice supermarket, you had to go around the Jura. So it's serpentines up and then around, and then, serpentines down. So I was driving on my own, and it was, just a few weeks before we came back, or a week or 2 before we came back. And there's a city or town called Bellegarde on the other side of the Jura. And it has a normal town sign. And I was driving along, and suddenly this thought came into my mind. And I could see the Bellegarde sign coming up, and I suddenly thought to myself, what does it say on the sign? But it was almost like a question to myself. And I said, well, I don't know, probably welcome to Bellegarde and that sort of rubbish, so who cares? And then I suddenly had the thought in my mind, but are you sure? What does it really say? And I said to myself, in the kind of not hearing voices type of thing, but your internal dialogue. And I said to myself, well, I don't really care. Maybe it's partnered with some town. Who gives a damn? And suddenly I thought, well, if you don't check now, you will maybe never find out. And at the time, this sentence was like, well, you know, I'm going back to Oxford. Of course, this is the last time I go shopping here. So I slowed down my car to have a look at the sign. And I read it, and it said, welcome to Bellegarde. And it was partnered with some cities, exactly as I expected and remembered. And I thought, okay, well, that was really worth my time. And I wanted to accelerate my car up from before I drove something like 80 kilometers per hour. Now I had slowed down to something like 40, maybe even slower. And as I was about to accelerate, two cars came around the bend, racing with one car right in my lane. And the car in my lane overtook the other one in the bend. And literally the gap between that car and the nose of my car was, I mean, not more than this. It was just shocking. I already thought, right, that's it, I'm gonna die. And then, you know, it was also after a rectangular bend. So then I had to slow down, and I was just shaking and take the bend. And I just thought, what the hell just happened? If I had been just a second faster, I would have died. And then now this was a memory at the time, and I just told my husband what, you know, how the maniac French had almost killed me on the road, you know, again, because I remembered at the time there were a lot of car accidents in the region. And then when I found out what's happening to me now, I found out that I've got head chips. I discovered that there's something called synthetic telepathy, where they, you know, tell you messages with ear chips and your, you know, and then I thought back and I thought, hang on. That sounds like a near-lethal synthetic telepathy field test that was done on me. And I tried to remember the incident. And one of the things that kept bugging me at the time was this car was coming right at me, and I couldn't remember the driver. I couldn't remember if it was one driver, two drivers. Was it a man or a woman? I had no recollection. And as I was chewing my pencil, trying to remember the scene, I suddenly had a flashback, and I remembered seeing exactly what it was. And I know why I didn't remember driver, because there wasn't one. It was a remote controlled car. So in other words, what I was the victim of, or near victim of, is the, you know, I would say a synthetic telepathy field test where they used remote controlled cars in the region. And I later also discovered that the sign that I had, you know, by just going on Google Maps, the sign had been moved for this entire test to be right behind this right angle. So I can confirm that I, as a scientist, was being used by potentially the French military, maybe working with the Swiss military. And also, by just remembering the region, I can also tell people that there's a big, fat French military base under the Jura facing down Cern. So I'm 100% sure about that. There's also something called Fort L'Écluse at the end, the tip of it, which is an old defense fort. But there are always several cars standing next to a dilapidated entrance. So I think these cars are going into the main, military base there. And it would make sense, because that would be the mountain range looking down on the plain, so on the Swiss. So if you had any Swiss armies coming your way, you would want to have all your equipment in the mountain. So that's things I can definitely confirm, and that they have this sort of synthetic telepathy and biological experiments going on there. And they're using CERN personnel 100%. So that much is certain. Now, the question about the accelerator, another piece of information you might be interested in is that when they had the shutdown, what we were told, okay, as physicists, because as you very accurately explained, you are using the data that CERN gives to you. And I think that's also very important, you know. In the olden days, I would have never, ever questioned that, you know.
Right.
And there are always physicists who make sure they run their analysis also on the main data set and so on and so on. But then now I think, hang on, were these my colleagues or those physicists running the analysis, were they maybe intel agents, you know, in the employ of the intelligence agency? So this element of, well, you always have a couple of infiltrators. I'm aware of this now, and I wasn't earlier. Now, the big cataclysmic shutdown that happened, I can tell you the story that was told to the physics community, which is that, so I think at the time, the person who was in charge of CERN was a guy called Chris Llewellyn, and the Llewellyn-Smith equation is named after him. But he, I think, was the DG at the time, and he gave a speech in Oxford, and he explained what happened. And he said, when they started operating the accelerator, so I should also say that 8 Tesla is, you know, 10,000 times, you know, or 80,000 times. as much as the Earth's magnetic field. However, if you have a modern MRI, that might also produce something like 8 Tesla. So Oxford had an experimental machine in 2010 that produced, I think, exactly 8 Tesla. But anyway, you know, what's special about CERN is that you produce these 8 Tesla on a 30-kilometer ring. So massive, okay, absolutely massive. And the entire 30-kilometer ring is superconducting. Now, when you have superconductivity, one of the big issues is that to keep it superconducting, you have to ensure that you don't have any friction whatsoever, because any friction generates heat, which quenches the superconducting magnet. And then you just have a normal magnet. So what you have is a current that's running around on a superconducting, pathway, hitting a normal resistor, and it just goes into meltdown, and you've got nonlinear forces and so on. So what Professor Llewellyn showed us was an image of what the accident site looked like, and they had to shut down because the magnet quenched, and it's a catastrophic event because the magnetic forces are so large. They think it was 100-meter strip of magnet that was kind of like crunched up and twisted and turned, and it just looked like a car crash.
I've seen it.
Exactly. So now the question is, why did it quench? And what many people don't know is to have this sort of magnetic fields, you still have kind of, old-fashioned wires running around, and you've got very many of them, and you need to kind of solder on, the little connectors. Now, I'm not an expert on the magnets and the accelerator, but it was as it was explained to us, when you're soldering it on, you have to make sure that the resistivity, so the resistance, if you like, of your soldering is exactly within the parameters. And if not, the whole thing blows up. Now, there were 3 companies involved in making the magnets. One was Italian, one was French, and one was German. And in the end, Professor Llewellyn, as a joke, asked us to guess which company screwed up. So he said, these companies were under immense time pressure to produce the right magnets, and some of the resistivity was just plain wrong. And that's what produced this cataclysmic breakdown. But people should know that there are, I think, tens of thousands of these little connectors. So what's the probability of screwing up? So in Italian, French, and German, and of course, he asked the British Oxford team, and we all guessed it would be the Italians, I'm sorry to say, because that's just the image we have of the Italians, laid back and, and it turned out, no, it was the Germans. So it was a German company. Now, if I want to say in the olden days, I would have just laughed it off. Now, what I know about everything, I can't laugh it off anymore. And then we have another German connection here. The question is, why would you want to delay the project? Would you want to delay the starting? Was it maybe malicious sabotage by somebody else, or what's the purpose? Or would you want to create these nonlinear magnetic forces that you unleashed in the meltdown?
I suspect. Let me give you my speculation. I'm fascinated with the idea of torsion, which in most physics is ignored. But let's think in terms of dynamic torsion here. You've got the proton synchrotron, which is feeding the proton stream into the Hadron Collider. And if you look at the axis of rotation of the Hadron Collider, the proton synchrotron is canted off that axis of rotation, so that if you were to bring it down on top of the Hadron Collider, it's going to be a ring on top of the ring. And you're counter-rotating the proton stream in the Hadron Collider to create the collisions. Now, with such immense magnetic fields, I'm thinking that's going to create a massive torsion effect. In other words, it's going to create something totally different, or as you're putting it, nonlinear magnetic forces. It's going to create something totally different in the macrocosmic world than just a particle stream. If you bring the proton synchrotron into the picture, it's possible, the way I'm thinking, to create a precessional wobble in the whole thing. In other words, you're creating resonance effects in the whole structure of the collider. There's 5 accelerators, if I remember correctly, a linear accelerator, and then finally the proton synchrotron, which injects it into the Hadron Collider. So the way I'm looking at it is it's very possible, in my way of thinking, that you're creating a massive torsion effect that they're either not thinking about, or that they literally are trying to create, and that they may have been successful, and that it may have been that massive torsion result that ripped those magnets out of their position, rather than the public story that we've been told. This is why I'm so suspicious of the whole thing, because with such massive, and I've been saying that for years, even before I wrote that book, with such massive magnetic fields, to me, it just doesn't make sense that you would have a bunch of scientists not taking this into account. But if they are taking it into account, if this is an effect that they're literally trying to create, which would be a macrocosmic hyperdimensional effect, this would be something you'd want to keep very, very secret. So in other words, the way I'm looking at it, yeah, the particle physics is the public face of the project. But I think that, going back to Gabriel Krohn and his thinking about hyperdimensional mathematics in laboratory circuits, that this is definitely something that is probably a part of a secret level of the experiment. And the reason that I'm thinking in those terms is I go back to the Nazi bell story, which I spent a lot of time in my books about, because what were the Nazis doing with the bell? Well, they had a couple of counter-rotating drums in this device, in my opinion, probably stacked one on top of the other so that you could create this differential rotation. And then they had a serum which was placed in these drums that would spin them up. They were hollow, so that you're cohering the plane of rotation in these two drums. And the serum is described in the literature as having been a cherry red, heavy metallic goo. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's some compound of mercury, maybe thorium oxide isomer or something like that. And you're spinning this up in this device, and then you're pulsing it. This to me is the fantastic part of the story. You're pulsing it with gobs of direct current electricity. So I'm thinking what they're trying to do here is they're trying to create a massive torsion effect, and they're trying to measure, by means of the radioactive substance, any time dilation effects they're getting in the radioactive decay with this device. So magnify the bell, which the Germans are working on, all throughout World War II. And incidentally, that's the highest classified project inside the Third Reich, not the atomic bomb. This strange little device that they've built. Well, you take the bell's dimensions, which were about 15 to 18 feet wide, so, figure that the drums are going to be smaller. You magnify this massive magnetic field, you magnify it to the scale of CERN, and again, what do you have? You've got counter rotation, you're creating a differential rotation in a plasma, you are embedding it, which to me I think is a key component here, within a piezoelectric rock, and you're producing these enormous torsion effects in the magnetic field. That's why I think there's a whole other level to this project that's hyperdimensional in nature, and it has nothing to do with particle physics. And this is why I think there's a secret level to it. Now, the mind control aspect here interests me, because I just finished this new book, Microcosm and Medium. And what's very interesting in the patent literature of what you're calling synthetic telepathy, and that's exactly the term that the US Army uses for this stuff. What's very interesting to me, Dr. Horton, is that if you read these patents, it over and over appears that what they're doing is they're modulating information into very, very strong magnetic fields and producing these interior conversations. Now, there is a paper that was produced by an American neurophysiologist, Michael Persinger, I think was his name. I know the last name is Persinger, in which he posits the possibility of being able to use this type of modulated magnetic field to entrain and modulate information on a global scale into people's minds. And I'm thinking, voila, where do you have on the planet a huge enough magnetic field that could induce things into the medium of the Earth itself and produce effects like this. And the interesting thing is they've got it down to the point now where they are able to read the electroencephalographic prints of an individual's brainwaves in certain specific conversational things. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is you could modulate specific information into a magnetic field and make that magnetic field have a global reach, but only one individual would hear it. And if you can do that, then you can modulate several channels of information into that magnetic field, and people are going to be hearing different, voices in their heads. So I'm willing even today now, long after I wrote the book on the CERN thing, to entertain the idea that maybe there's even yet a fourth layer to this project, that they're engaged in some sort of mind manipulation technology with this device, as well as the hyperdimensional torsion experiments that I think they might be conducting, all of these data correlation experiments I think that they might be conducting under the veneer of doing particle physics. So I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I think there are multiple levels to this project, and the very fact that it's a sovereign entity kind of clues me in that that's probably true.
I think that is entirely possible. I think your dog knows that time's up, so we should probably wrap up. But I think I think it's entirely possible. That's what I can say, because when I look at how science is funded, it is just we as scientists, we don't get the money. The
Right.
project gets the money. When you work at CERN, the typical thing is that you're given a laptop, but not necessarily a desk. I mean, I was lucky, I got a desk. But, if you get a banana box, you already assume your supervisor must love you. You're very special because you can sit on a banana box. So I'm exaggerating, but that's pretty much the entire approach of particle physicists. So we are, made to make do with, we've got all this fancy equipment, but then what's given to us is very minimal. But then we have the situation whereby there are these big holy projects that are sucking large amounts of money. And by now, I just don't discount it at all. In fact, I expect it. Wherever I went, there was always a second layer, simply for the reason that you can use anything for multiple purposes. And the intelligence agencies and the militaries have been around for so long. If there's another way of using something, they will do that. They will just put a floor in, or, for you, it will look like a ceiling. You will never rise above, and you will never get to know the real project. And as I said, working there, I've discovered that there's so much going on. Working at Oxford, I discovered that there's so much going on. And maybe another day we can compare notes about what we observed at Oxford, because that's also a highly suspicious, strange place with lots of things going on. So
let me leave you with a mind blower. In one of the dimensional rotations of string theory, it's in 11 dimensions, if I remember correctly, right?
I think so, yeah. A lot of them, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's 11 dimensions in one of the dimensional rotations of the theory, and 26, I think, is the other. Well, interestingly enough, neurophysiologists have recently discovered that the human brain, if you do a topological mapping of the human brain, the neuronal network, and so on, it's best mapped in 11 dimensions.
Oh boy! You know what?
Oh boy.
I mean, the particle case. This is another little bit of nugget from my side. For particle physicists, string theory as a theory isn't worth that much, because
I agree.
Basically worth at all, because it cannot predict anything. You can't predict masses and so on. So we were always scoffing at string theory. It was certainly not for our purposes as particle physicists. So I wonder, what is it for? And it could very well be.
I do too.
Absolutely. So, gosh, I mean, this has been mind-blowing. I thank you so very much, Dr. Farrell, because the truth is that there are not many people on planet Earth that one can have a conversation like that with. People who really know about all these topics in great detail, and are also tuned in to the fact that there's always a second or third or fourth, layer above everything.
Yep. Well, thank you for having me on.
I absolutely. I thank you very, very much. And to my listeners, I just would like to encourage you to start researching, because everything we talked about today, these extraterritorial areas, the financial flows, the secret societies, the secret weapons technologies, it turns out it's not esoteric, it's not out there. It turns out it affects us every day, pretty much, without noticing. So it looks like you agree with that statement.
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So, thank you once more, Dr. Farrell. And, I hope that maybe in a future point we can come back and maybe talk about Oxford and all these
Oh, certainly.
when
Certainly.
I've done my research. But I think what I will do now, and actually just before we finish, I would like to point people to your books once more, because maybe now they understand why it's so important to learn about all these very topics here. So again, Dr. Farrell's website is gizadeathstar.com. And if you go to books, you will find all these many books. And we have just scratched the surface, because you mentioned your book about the Jesuits, I think, and here, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. And I think this is the technology that you were talking about just now at the end. So I'm most certainly going to look into that, because the truth is that as a high energy physicist, on paper, I have, I've been to all these places, I've got the t-shirts, but the reality is that, even the scientists who've been to these places, who were scientists at Oxford and who were scientists at CERN, there's stuff being kept from them. And sometimes people like me, we are even being used as guinea pigs without our knowledge, as I learned to my detriment. So I think for our own survival, we need to, read your books, Dr. Farrell, and actually, do our homework and find out what's actually going on. So thank you. Thank you very much once more. It was a special honor to have you on the show. And it is now, I've got my reading list, set out for the time to come. So thank you very much. And let me say, have a good evening, everybody. Bye for now. And I'll see you, on Thursday with the Global Crime Fighters. Thank you very much. And bye.
Thank you for having me on.